welcome to the first sort of set of open sessions of the year around safety and inclusion across the SIGCHI family of conferences. As per usual, I just want to rapidly cover our community norms for this session, which will be posted sort of long form in the collaborative notes, and there's a link there. So yeah, you can add pronouns to your username by right-clicking the box, which contains your face in the Zoom window, and then selecting rename. When speaking, we ask that you state your name, pronouns, and institution. This is required but not encouraged. Any participation, so questions, comments, content posted to the chat or the collaborative document are recorded for accessibility and transparency's sake. So as such, your consent is ongoing. We will post this session in full with additional accessibility options on the SIGCHI YouTube channel. And if you're posting about this after the event, hashtag SIGCHI and hashtag Open Talks are your hashtags of choice. Yeah, as always, our time together serves to highlight the incredibly complicated interactions between individual experiences and systemic policies and operations. These are sources of ongoing frustration, violence, and oppression for many. And as with anyone's personal experiences, that frustration is understandably valid. There will be no questioning of firsthand experiences permitted in this space. We're an internationally diverse group of humans here, and so not everyone arrives at the same level of education or cultural access to social justice or matters of identity. And so that means that there may be times when identifying words, phrases, and understandings are insensitive or hurtful. And if these moments do come up in this session, we just want to ask that you be patient, show sensitivity to anyone who has the floor, take each other in good faith, and just offer a sort of quick correction and refocus on the topic of the moment. Keep aware of how much time and space you're taking up, and that others may need a moment of silence to sort of collect themselves before speaking. And as always, we want you to be critical, just constructively so. Be kind, supportive, be hard on systems and soft on people. We have a live chat and live captions. In the event of harassment, discrimination, or additional needs by another attendee or a presenter, I certainly hope that's not the case, please directly message an organizer. So that would be myself. I see Elena in the chat. Michael is in the chat as well. Kata, Rosie, and Kaylee. Any of those are very safe, highly recommended points of contact for you here. As the session sort of centers on those often marginalized and silenced, I'd like to ask you to allow space in discussion for those with less privilege to sort of speak first. But I guess it's also important to note here that we'll be covering a range of potentially triggering and upsetting topics, since the session is about safety and harm writ large, sort of at our conferences, at our events. So let's be sensitive to what that evokes in people. Any mention of assault, discrimination, oppression, substance use, or harm will only be mentioned with the intention of preventing them at our events. And as you can see in the chat, Elena has posted both a Slido to post and upvote any other questions as a secondary way to engage, as well as a collaborative doc so that you can sort of follow along, make comments, allow yourself to sort of have a record of being heard there. And with all that said, I guess I can introduce myself. I'm Cale Passmore. So pronouns are they, them, he, or really any of your choice. I'm your SIGCHI Equity Chair. I'm an interdisciplinary knowledge worker and impact analyst for the Saskatchewan Indian Institute of Technologies. And I'm speaking to you from Saskatoon, Canada, which is on Treaty 6 land. That's unceded homeland of the Métis and many First Nations people, from the Saulteaux to the Plains and Woods Cree, Dene, Nakota, Lakota, Dakota First Nations. And as a white settler that benefits from the violence of ongoing colonialism, the fact that I'm speaking to you here today carries with it a tension. And that's sort of between whose voice is heard and whose voice is granted power to set norms and policies, and whose voices are most affected by those norms and don't have that same privilege. This is actually part of why you're here today. The safety plan that we're introducing here is a response to a necessary demand across our community for improved safety. The basis for these documents that we're about to show you began from experiences that were collected across the equity talks, from interviews with chairs, different groups, grassroots organizations, and communities, both sort of in and adjacent to SIGCHI. These works and these draft plans are not meant to be comprehensive or complete. Of course, they're living documents. They're going to require continual editing, continual update, continual refinement. They should sort of evolve and be shaped as our community does. So yeah, I guess before introducing them, I just want to say that these works are under development. I'd encourage you to comment, to respond, to suggest anything, any thoughts, any experiences, any advice that come to mind. Just know that format, scope, sort of exact wording and examples that we use, the resources that help supplement them are prone to change. So for our purposes today, I just want to keep things to a sort of general overview. And that's because our time today is tight. We will have additional sessions to be able to deep dive into each of these documents. And we'll let you know as those come up. So it's sort of the Equity Committee's general philosophy here that equity is a sensibility. It's a perspective and it's a learned set of reactions. The resources here today are early steps to developing those skills across the SIGCHI community. So community involvement and feedback, including open talks like these, are necessary to further refine them. I encourage you to like save the links to these things, to share them, to brainstorm on them. I know at CHI we'll also have opportunities for the community to engage with us around a lot of these safety plans. So with that said, the last two caveats, and then we can actually get into the nitty-gritty here. It's that everything here is a series of recommendations and points for consideration. At this point in time, we can't set ACM policy. We can, however, collectively agree on best practices for meaningful inclusion and encourage those around us to stay within them. We can create community accountability. So input from SIGCHI's committees on these documents are going to be immensely helpful, given the expansive and intersectional nature of equity. That means that if you're serving on any of the SIGCHI equity or SIGCHI committees, not just the equity committee, please do share these resources with them as well. I'm going to share the collaborative document so that we can kind of go through this together. This is coming up. Everyone can sort of follow that's able to.
Yeah.
So we've tried to respond to the need for greater safety at our events by listening to what some of the major pain points have been and what some of the barriers have been. And across that, we know that we need to create a sense of, create a sense of accountability to the norms that so many of us believe in, need to feel safe. And we can't do that with a community as diverse as ours without also providing educational resources around that. The two have to go hand in hand because we are coming from such different places. We need as well to take an approach that can simultaneously educate and create accountability with SIGCHI leadership and event leaders, as well as attendees, community, and guests. So education and training is an essential part here of creating consistent standards and norms. To open that up is sort of the bigger project here, which is the Allyship and bystander training program. This is a sort of opt-in training module for building community awareness of power dynamics, discrimination and oppression, and creating safe bystander intervention. Long-term, big picture, we want this to be modular and scalable for in-person, virtual, and hybrid formats. And one of the biggest asks that we have actually is that when Kaylee and I had sort of launched this in 2019 as a pilot project, we saw that there was a very big ask that any sections devoted to specific axes of oppression, like racism, genderism, ableism, instruction and content be taught from people who can personally relate to those experiences, which makes sense. There's so many nuances that can't just come from knowledge and ideation. So we are looking for groups willing to sort of help put these sections together. If I can shift to this, perfect. So A little bit of this is, outdated. We wanted to retain a bit of what was shown in the 2019 CHI presentation that we did on this. We'd like each conference that ends up adopting this or offering programming around this to update it according to their conference space. But in the Allyship guide, we have important terminology, just keywords that are being used, important sort of organizational structures. Eventually, we'll have a sort of organizational map showing where authority and accountability runs throughout ACM all the way down to the very event that you're at. We'll be discussing and presenting on sort of what being an ally is, what that involves. And for us, that's sort of a 4-part: observing, listening, directing, and recording or documenting, I guess you could say. So again, avoiding the sort of like very narrow approach to this. Avoiding getting into much of that. We found that there's actually quite an important need for better mapping of spaces, and that helps with navigation. We will have an online sort of component for that, and that involves what channels are active, what platforms are being used, and obviously helpful resources. So there's policies on this page. There will be event-specific aspects to this. There will be reporting structures and where you can sort of like demand accountability from some of ACM and SIGCHI's organizations. There is a bit of training around what the current policies are and what they aren't. And that's where that sort of community accountability aspect needs to come in. So important definitions, examples of what is harassment, what is discrimination, what is consent. That's all in here at this point. We then dovetail sort of into bias and different forms of oppression. So we wanted to open up this training with a bit on epistemological diversity, and then begin to sort of explore what some of the major axes of discrimination are. So that includes this sort of wheel of a lot, not all, but many of the different forms of power and oppression that are present in almost every space that we'll be in at a SIGCHI event. This is the first of, I think, 5 clusters that we want to provide direct sort of hands-on experiences and tips for sort of like what to be aware of, how to spot different forms of oppression. Ableism, body shaming, attraction bias is one of them. Another module that we would really like to develop and have sort of taught live as much as possible is on colonialism, racism, and xenophobia. So that includes, aspects of white supremacy. Sexism, homophobia, and transphobia is another section that gets a little bit more into consent and different sort of power dynamics, classism, ageism, elitism, and that we would really like to include some aspects on caste and make it, a lot of these materials can end up being very like US, North American centric, and we want to, destabilize that as early on as possible in the sort of training for allyship. Finally, is the section on bystander intervention. So if you are aware of what different aspects of oppression and discrimination and social pressure look like, what are you supposed to do in those instances where you spot them, or you may see them begin to creep up? We're currently just in the process of getting permission for one of the core aspects, the 5 sort of Ds: distract, delegate, document, delay, and direct, from right2be.org, which has a very standardized, quite effective bystander intervention training framework. And that is sort of what takes us to the end of the allyship program. So before I get into the other 2 components of this safety plan, one of which is sort of on attendee, I wouldn't say maybe guidelines, but best practices for inclusive and non-harmful behavior, and the other side of it is leadership behavior, things to be keeping aware of. Are there any immediate thoughts or feelings, major omissions that you can see from this allyship programming? Michael?
I don't want to go first if other people want to go, but I don't see other hands. So, okay, I'll blather. And I tried to say this in Slido and I ran out of characters twice. In CARES, we've been talking with Right to Be. And one of the problems I think we see is that our interventions happen in a community, and which is different from a subway car and the famous man with the French fries, and different from street harassment. And especially if it's an early career person doing the intervening, they're going to have to face that oppressor, that abuser, that person who made a mistake, choose your language, afterwards, and they're going to be at risk. And so, so the 5Ds don't do it for me because they don't accommodate that kind of risk by the intervener. Now, some of the dealing with that risk is probably community responsibility rather than but anyway, I don't know. I mean, this is not my program, but it's a concern that we've been wrestling with now for maybe 6 months. So just wanted to report the concern.
No, I think that's incredibly helpful. The fact that, you know, even if you don't run into the sort of person who is the harasser on a regular basis at these conferences, they are part of peer reviews. They're part of like those long-term systems. So what we need to do is be able to approach that, create accountability. I know Sakai Cares is doing a lot of work, as you're saying, on what can be done about that. One of the plans after this is to begin looking at sort of publishing and peer review and how we can kind of intervene at moments like that. But if you have suggestions about maybe what type of framework could operate better in this space than like the 5Ts, or if maybe just another module needs to be put in.
Let's talk offline, but thank you. Oh, and I forgot to say Michael Muller on the stolen lands of the Wampanoag and Massachusetts people who are still here and who would like their land back. And my pronouns are he, him. Sorry, I didn't do that properly before.
No, thank you. And Ankit, I believe you have a hand up.
Yeah, perfect. You mentioned in the slide number 31 or 32, the Indian caste structure, right? So it was in the like 5,000 years ago. So right now there is not such a casteism structuring. The first thing is this. Okay. The second thing, with addition to the Michael, that the street bullying or something like how we can help the person in the streets also. Because the conference in Germany, and once I went to Germany, and I feel that the people are not so kind of easy with the other people, in the sense of if I searching some restaurant or searching for the cinema hall or something like that. So I think we should provide a little bit German pronunciations and kind of dictionary that people can understand that this is the basic terms that you can heard from the either side, or same thing for the bullying or allying kind of. So it's easy to them that, okay, someone is talking about me in a different sense, not in a positive manner. So this might be also a help to the person, those who are attending the conference. And the third thing that I thought that we should have generate one form in the sense of feedback form. So we can get the feedback from all the attendees, those who are attending the conference, that during the conference, what is their experience and what is their difficulties. And even after the conference, whether they have the pleasant memories or what kind of memories they are going with to their nation. So might be we should think on that. Okay, that's all from my end.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you. I think if I've been able to hold all the sort of pieces. We have a couple note takers as well, but of what you said, there's a little bit of, there's a lot more emphasis on building cultural awareness for the local, wherever the event is being held, in place on event leadership, which I can show you that section here in a second. That is absolutely something that we've heard a lot of the community requesting. Like, we don't have control over venues outside of, say, the conference space, but we do have control over which venues are encouraged and which spaces may or may not be as safe. How we can educate attendees about what those spaces might be like and what the cultural norms around where they are can be.
Suppose you don't have to go after 10 o'clock in a particular place or something like that.
Yeah.
Because this is also an important aspect for the outcomers.
Absolutely. I think, better newcomer sort of training as well as cultural training is really essential here. And, you brought up Caste, and I think that's another excellent example of where that's in there, because there's been some folks demanding or asking for education around this and how that affects different decisions. But that's not something I can personally speak to. That's why I should not be educating on that, right? So having dedicated folks with those experiences is a mandatory part of this, and it makes it way more complicated, but there's no point in doing it incorrectly or harmfully. I just want to turn really quickly, while we can, to a comment here by Hatisse. Is that correct? Perfect. Saying, will these voluntary roles be introduced to conference attendees before or during the event? And what happens after reporting incidents? So documentation, just to touch on that really quickly, is something that's really, really necessary and quite absent in many ways. We're finding, for example, event leaders are not aware that they actually have the power to remove people from events. Actual reporting kind of goes in many different directions, which is a good thing, because you may not feel comfortable reporting something to sort of ACM, but you may feel more comfortable reporting to, say, SIGCHI Cares, or directly to an equity chair with which you have a bit more of a personable relationship. So on the back end, we're talking about, navigating that tricky space of seeing what pipelines we can create for reporting, but not wanting to betray consent either. And obviously that is actually something that's very complicated, but SIGCHI Cares has been taking up pretty well, and we'll be able to update the community on reporting structures. As for when it will be introduced, we plan to have a few SIGCHI community trainings overall that will probably be virtual. Ideally would be hybrid, definitely has to be live. But then we would like as many conferences as can opt in to offer this at the beginning or just before the conference itself takes place, so that people are walking into these spaces with this sort of training and awareness. The exact implementation has yet to be determined, but we're currently working out next year's budget, and within that, budgeting for, say, specialists to be able to be present at different events. Kata, I see that you have your hand up as well.
Yes, so this is Kata Spiel. My pronouns are they, them. I am at TU Wien currently. I'm shit at international flying. And I have 3 points. Is that okay? Just waited until they accumulated. I have very direct language. I'm very sorry about that. Mr. German and neurodivergent, it's a toxic combination. I wrote down that the term ally is useless if self-chosen. So the thing is, the core problem that I have with that being an allyship program is that allies self-identify, and I feel that is not what allies do if they are allies. Allies are identified by marginalized communities. So maybe there is just a better way of describing the role that is taken on there, because it's just through that program kind of indicates to the uninitiated that you choose to be an ally when that is in fact not the case, right? So maybe there is like just, maybe it's just bystander or active bystander, or like just like, you know, trustee because it's a person you can trust. I don't know, like whatever you want to be communicating, but I'm not sure ally necessarily communicates it very well, especially if it's a self-chosen role. Okay, so that was my first way, but it's also fine. Oh, that I also wanted to preface that even though I say these things, that doesn't mean they have to be changed immediately or anything. It's also okay if things are not perfect, and tension is also fine. Like this is not a dig. It's just like, you know,
Do you
it's
mind if
also a position. Yeah.
Do you mind if I pop in real quick? Yeah, you're completely like right. This is actually something that we thought about back in 2019. It's something that comes up every session, every single time we use the term. There's always a little bit of cringe on our part, and we do need better language around that. Like we need to implement that because yeah, it's just as bad to sort of self-declare as an ally as it is to like wear a pin that says ally. So we need to find ways to like indicate to the community that like you've been through this training and find the appropriate terms for it. So I think that's like one of the next things to workshop around a bit.
Before I say my other things, I think Anki wants to reply
Please.
directly.
Yeah. Actually, I forgot one thing to add. Shall we do that? We can mention that the particular person in DA committee or even the whole chairs, that a particular person knows a particular languages. For example, I'm from India, so I know Indian languages plus English. So this is quite easy for the communicators, because sometimes it happens that a person from India may be shy to talk to the other person because of the language barrier and so on. So we can also put this in a very well way.
I love that idea. I think that's super important as well.
Oh, I agree with that too, even though I don't have many living languages that I speak. There was a point in time when I spoke more dead ones, so to speak. Anyway, not the point. So I then wanted to agree a bit with Michael in that what we define as a conference context isn't well defined either. Because a lot of harassment that happens at or surrounding conferences has a history that kind of like seeps in there, or a future that, you know, is targeted by that. And we do have community platforms within Sikai official or non-official that are used for harassment, and that then has effects on conferences, as Kaylee knows, because I just like left the Slack where it's supposed to be ACing because I have no interest in being in the same spaces as some other people. Like I'm also happy to talk about this, like but I also, yeah, it's just what we define as like relating to a conference is sometimes, I think, ill-defined and has blurry boundaries, and I feel it's important that that is acknowledged by people, just in terms of like that this is icky stuff in that regard, and that we cannot even fully do that, and like things seep in and out, and I think it's important to just like acknowledge that as well. Beyond that, it's a living document. And then you were adamantly talking about how we need to kind of like have people educating who have lived experiences, and I do agree, but I also disagree at the same time, just because it is often very much expected from people in marginalized positions to educate as well, and it's like kind of like something that like at least on the axes where I'm marginalized, I have to do over and over and over again, and I'm kind of sick of it in some degree, because like I don't actually like to talk about the same thing over and over again, at least not like that. And it's also always kind of a recollection of trauma. So if we could find ways that allow us to kind of like minimize the negative effects of that, and I don't know, I just like I just noted that when you said that it didn't sit right with me, and then thought about it a brief moment, right? But if we find these ways, and I mean, there are also like, there's this one study in fat context where like the thing is also that marginalized people are often dismissed when it's about their experiences that they have. And within fat studies, there is kind of like a fairly prominent study that shows that if thin people talk about how they changed their approach towards fat people and understood that fat fat hate is just not a great position to have. That is more effective than fat people saying like it feels a bit shitty when you do that. And so, sorry, very direct language.
This is perfect. This is perfect.
But like that it needs kind of like both of these areas, and that is often like, you know, people respond more to people that they can identify with, and it's not even something that we can kind of like criticize on them. It's just like how we're kind of like wired sometimes, right?
Absolutely. I think that is one of the things we've gone back and forth a bit. And like Elena or Kaylee, if you wanted to jump in on this for a second, if you have other thoughts, like to be really transparent, part of the process here has been like, okay, epistemic exploitation and re-traumatization through training are two really big things. Also, though, needing those resources to be not just like intellectualized. And so how can we balance that? And I mean, on one hand, that's why we're really trying to dig into the budget, which actually becomes an almost policy matter, because trying to pay volunteer communities as a nonprofit organization is tricky, but we may be finding out some ways to do it. So at least if we can provide initial funding for the core of that, then there's some payment for that. The next thought is like, well, we don't want to be paying people to re-traumatize them. That is a messy system to begin with as well. So as you're sort of pointing out, that like big important tension is kind of what we need to figure out next, especially in the development of this. So how we can do this work, create that educational knowledge base and training without causing harm in the process of doing so. So yeah, hopefully through these conversations and through like ongoing dialogue, we can find like the best way forward with that. Am I missing anything, equity committee members?
No, I think you actually covered it quite well. Thank you.
Awesome. Okay. If you don't mind, with the last sort of 20 minutes, I'd like to just go through these last two documents in our programming. So the first here is actually what we're developing as a sort of chronological checklist from an equity perspective for leadership. And that's because, as has been pointed out so far, there's some problems and flaws in how we're doing recording and tracking of instances that come up and pain points. And so one year, you know, there may be gender signs on bathrooms that are missing, and so much work went into actually just getting those all gender bathrooms there, labeled and accessible. After 5 years, because it's not a pain point in being brought up regularly, that is something that, you know, leadership, without the amount that they have to balance, may forget about. And so we want to sort of begin a better documentation and institutional knowledge way of tracking this. So for a lot of this, we've broken it down into sort of like the earliest stages of conference planning, and then it goes to sort of pre-conference site selection, right before the conference, during the conference, and then what needs to be done or considered afterward. And this is also where we need help, just like where this checklist came from was like past reports. It was those equity talks. It was those pain points we've been hearing the community talk about. And we have a kind of format here where in bold, you can see the sort of principle. In italics right after is a bit of an expansion. And then below that are the questions that you need to be able to answer as event leadership, as well as resources that may be really essential and important. So a lot of what gets covered in this sort of leadership aspect here is actually, sorry, just want to respond to a couple messages in the chat first. So Ankit had mentioned, shall we provide unique contact number, some kind of emergency number for any kind of misbehavior? So this is due to people having more faith on conventional call lines rather than technology-based solution in the case of emergency. This is something that I'm personally invested in, but I think falls a bit more under the authority and role of SIG Chi Cares for maybe like initiating. Michael would be able to speak a bit more on that, as well as Rosie and Kaylee. I believe you're still with Sig Chi Cares. Yeah. Perfect. If I'm forgetting anyone as well, please just nudge me and let me know. Tedesspiel pointed to the paper on epistemic exploitation. It's a great read. If you're not familiar with it, I definitely suggest checking it out. And Scott Armstrong said, thought for conference and event management, making feedback and observations by individuals could be a communications section in a conference app. This data could be stored for routing issues to correct groups that can take action. That's actually very clever. And that's also something I think that we need to dig into a little bit more. We do have a little bit of emphasis on communication and reporting structures in both event leadership and attendee guidelines. So, you know, it's necessary. We're really recommending very heavily that conference organizers know and have a plan for feedback, issues, documentation, reporting channels, for being able to report, as you'll see at the end, everything that's happened, so that that next chair is inheriting this living document and ongoing list of like pain points and what their resolutions are. So we've got other aspects of this, like useful guides, including some of our communities developed best guidelines for, say, gender equity and inclusivity. There's key considerations in site, venue, and vendor selection. So that goes as basic as sort of restrooms to diet, food. Liquor and alcohol has been a very complicated and contentious sort of policy to try and set. Sig Chi, at least, is no longer funding alcohol, and therefore, you know, we can't tell, say, Chi or other spaces what they can and can't do, but we can provide like very strong recommendations that it be free of alcohol, or that if alcohol is sold, food must be provided with an array of free non-alcoholic options. We have guides for destimulation rooms, prayer rooms, safe spaces, and information zones, checking to make sure that cultural holidays are accounted for and not just ignored when dates are planned. And if they are, how are you actually incorporating the fact that that event is taking place on a cultural holiday into the event itself? So we've noticed as well that there are moments where, say, accessibility chairs may be invited to do a site selection, sort of like spot visit and spot check. We're not seeing the same thing with, say, broader equity measures. Like, is the lighting within this space adequate for people to safely walk? You know, dark corridors, not necessarily like bad for low vision, but also more dangerous in terms of harassment, discrimination, and inappropriate behavior. Do people have safer ways to get from point A to point B if they're necessary parts of the program, right? So encouraging specialists in equity to be able to sort of spot check at different points. So again, there's, you know, considerations for SV training, epistemological diversity that goes into what types of papers are being accepted and considered, what types of panels are being put together. An important aspect of, let me see where this was. Yeah, consulting locally elected leaders on cultural inclusion and cultural and regional impacts of the event, so that well before that happens, so that the event is much more culturally relative than I think we see in many instances. Aspects around visas and international travel. We'd also like to see sort of projected costs, right? So you may have funding to be able to fly and stay and go to the conference, but arrive and find out that you cannot afford the food that is local and domestic, and you can't just rely on, say, conference food to get through. So giving students and other folks a better sense of how much cost they'll be incurring in that region is an important part. I see in the chat, are we allowed to share these documents with others right away, or does it require further work before releasing? Kaylee and Elena, are you comfortable with it being released right away? I feel like it's sort of out in the public at this point, and anyone is welcome to comment, but.
Yeah, the links are out there. So
Perfect. And then in
I
that
think
case,
it's actually sorry. I think my
Please.
internet, there is a delay, so I keep cutting in. I was going to say that I think it's actually for the best to share these links as much as possible to gather as much feedback from other folks as possible. So please share away.
perfect. Yeah. And thank you to anyone who does share and helps us gather as many comments and reflections as possible. As well in the chat, SIGCHI Cares is in the process of designating a liaison for each SIGCHI conference. The name and contact information are supposed to be displayed during the conference opening plenary. However, that information may not be available when people need it. We need to make this information available at the local conference office, if there is one, at registration and in other parts of the venue. So please send in suggestions about other ways to help people find help. That's actually also a part of the allyship training and attendee guidelines is, finding some way. We don't like the hierarchy of badges. We don't want allyship pins. We need, indicators for certain things. Maybe not like best paper winner, but maybe like languages that I speak, training that I've received, ways to know that you can at least in a moment talk to someone that can direct you to the appropriate channels to report, to find better help, to find like more comfortable people to be around or to intervene. Yeah, so we've also included for this list of chairs, that are considered event leadership. We're kind of making this broad. It's any sort of event that does include like online spaces, temporary one-off talks, things like that. And then, what's needed for effective communication of safety supports to attendees, because we find again and again, just posting a link to it and then tweeting it once is not sufficient. It's not reaching the audience that's necessary. And there are ways that we, kind of lay out in some of the guides here, but are also needing more advising on for how to like get this information out, build this culture. Once that culture and those norms are built, how do we maintain that? That's sort of something we're approaching this at every step. So I will very quickly now shift us over to the attendee guidelines. And this is sort of, the intention for this is to be as short form, accessible. Everyone reads this maybe at registration and then clicks a box sort of saying that they are opting in to accept these types of behaviors and these types of inclusive actions. So our section here, or this document here, this point on the safety plan is broken down into sort of self-care, community care, and a section on institutional care. So you have sort of ideally this will be on a wiki to just give it better read, ease of access. And you have the sort of major point, a bit of explanation, examples, and then again, further resources. So for self-care, there's a lot of resources that we'd like to post around physical, mental, and social health and checking in, what that means. What does it mean to support your needs? What do you do if you feel unsafe, harassed, and are experiencing discrimination? If every conference has a link to this document on their page, if there's a constantly running wiki, and if folks at the conferences are aware of this, they may not remember and memorize that there are different groups that you can report to, but they can note to check this and then have those links and have those access points at hand. So we tried to even outline what different reporting structures are and what the pros and cons of each of them are. So, the conference general chair may have the most authority to act immediately to remedy a solution, but at the same time, they're difficult to find. They're also, maybe more intimidating. On the other end of that spectrum, we have our very helpful SVs or student volunteers or SIGCHI, allies or helpers or generally more educated people around power dynamics, and they have the least authority to be able to act and intervene, but they can provide that immediate sort of, at least I'm here and adding another body towards safety against maybe a discriminator or harasser. So there's a section around calling in, calling out, and intervening, sort of when we suggest to do each, and then different educational materials that are HCI specific on oppression, discrimination, and equitable practice. Matisse has added in the comments, considering that harassment incidents also happen in social events which are outside the conference venue, how would allies approach these? So a drunk person making racist jokes at the bar during the social event. This again is also very complicated because we don't want this, we don't want our organization or community to become a police state, but we also need much more authority and restriction around instances like that. So there are ways to report, say, to SIG-Chi Cares or even ACM that you are personally experiencing, even in an online space or from a publication, say racism or ableism, or you are witnessing someone being discriminatory that is in our community. I can't, give you the exact outcomes of what that means, but with a lot of our new sort of reporting protocols, it does mean that it gets on file, and it does mean that people begin to investigate it. It puts people like that on our radar to watch more closely and to sort of monitor in terms of what the effects of, say, even their publications are. So private racism, private elitism, private classism, those things, you know, complicated, but we're not paying attention, if that makes sense. Michael's added, I hope we can be careful not to tell SVs that they're responsible to intervene. As Kale said, they're among the most vulnerable of us. So perhaps SVs can carry a list of contacts that they can share with, say, survivors. And yeah, that's absolutely part of the training. We'd love all the SVs to be able to go through this allyship training as sort of mandatory part of their training. And in that are techniques for sort of gathering people around different issues, topics, and incidents that come up, and then who is available to them for support, for help, for need, both like during the event and after. And then the section sort of ends with community care. So what does it mean to support people's needs? What is consent? How can we support accountability? How can we build accountability? Ways to just in daily action create a sense of create a more inclusive space. In the very least, create a sense of a more inclusive space. And Kit, you have your hand up.
Yes. Actually, I want to add in this Hatise and Michael's comment that, for example, if we have 20 volunteers, student volunteers, and 100 presenters, so we can split 100 by 20. So each volunteer have 5 presenters. So we can directly tell that 5 presenters that you have to contact this volunteer for any kind of bullying or any kind of harassment. So it's a direct access to the volunteers and the presenters, even inside the venue as well as outside the venue. So rather than contacting direct to the chair, it is go through the proper process. Yeah, that's all.
I think that's an important, creating those more direct pipelines and those, let's say, standardized pipelines is important. I also think, though, from our experience, there are people who feel comfortable around other types of people, or who those experiences may be better shared with and cared for. And so we do want sort of as much diversity in that, and then have, say, an equity chair at a local conference that's not attached to SIG-Chi Cares or SIG-Chi, the executive committee, be able to know the questions to ask in order to escalate that and have that reporting go to the right sort of place. There are a lot of instances where, a victim really does not want that report or that experience escalated, and that has to be respected, because we can't betray consent if we're attempting to intervene in harassment and discrimination. So it's sort of maintaining that delicate balance of providing a lot of tools, but then having recommended streams through that, kind of as you're pointing to here. And I think with that, we can just sort of spend maybe the last, I know there's only 5 official minutes, but we'll run a little bit late if there are additional comments, thoughts, points of consideration that any of you would like to bring up. What do you all think of this as maybe the first steps in a larger safety plan across the SIGCHI series of events? You can tell us it's very underwhelming if you wish to. My feelings won't be too hurt. Does this seem helpful or useful? I see Kaylee nodding their biased head.
I think it's great, and the amount of effort you put in these documents, I cannot even imagine. It scares me, honestly. But in a positive way, because I realize, of course, we volunteer to be more careful about these and to sort of help people being more considerate about all these. But we also need a lot of education on different aspects of harassment and such incidents. When I see this Kai presentation with this chart of different types of what is it called, inequalities, I realized, oh yeah, definitely we need a lot of education before assigning people onto these roles, because it requires a lot of knowledge. Not only volunteering will be enough. So yeah, a lot of work is expecting us and those potential volunteers.
It's true, yeah, and that actually makes me really happy to hear. I have a couple of those different types of charts in my office just on the wall, because every day that I come into work, I'm like, there's always a couple axes that I'm not keeping in mind that day. Like it's so much, and it's not sufficient, but it is like something that at least we're being like, oh, I didn't know that, I have not actually reflected on, say, attraction bias. I don't know that I haven't, really considered how body norms are affecting my decisions. That's why this education thing is so key. We just need to make sure that we're pairing that education with action as well. And it's a big ask, but we're also seeing that the implementation is not as complicated as one might think, looking at it like so big picture. And then that we have a really caring community in general. A lot of people, I have yet to actually ever meet a single person that isn't somewhere on that sort of axis of oppression and can't at least relate to pain points of systemic discrimination in one way or another. And so leaning into that, leaning into the fact that it's a very small proportion of our community that are actively hateful, harmful humans. We can just keep working on building those norms together, I think, is the hope. Scott has added in the chat that this can become training to the other SIGs over time, for sure. We want to release this as a sort of open resource that anyone is able to pick up, implement. We do want, at bare minimum, there to be a sort of recorded version of a lot of this training and these educational materials, but with heavy, heavy emphasis on these being present training programs at the outset of a conference, and sort of annual regular check-ins. We'd really like event leadership to all attend at least one version of the allyship and bystander training intervention. Yeah, and we're hoping that education plus recommended routes of action and intervention at least can help us begin to build some standards around this. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Any other feelings? Is everyone feeling okay? That's good, at least. Yeah, if there's nothing else, then yeah, please keep these links and feel free to share them regularly. I'm a little bit intimidated by the amount of comments that may end up in these documents over the next month, but we will keep working through it because that is our job. So yeah, also, you know, consider as we keep making announcements moving forward, maybe if you feel you can actually speak to, say, one or more of those axes and help guide, you know, what you would like to see in ways that the Sikai community has maybe in the past violated those experiences of yours or those needs of yours. Yeah, we really do want to put together some teams of specialists around different axes of oppression, and develop those sort of best practices guidelines. But yeah, thank you all so much for being here on Valentine's Day, and just being here on any day, really. And thank you for all your thoughts, wisdom, insights.
Thanks, Gail. If I can just add real quick,
Mhm.
that we will keep the collaborative notes document open for editing, maybe until the end of the day today, or maybe also tomorrow. I don't know. Suggest what works best for you, and then we will switch it to read only, I think. But you can feel free to add comments if you wish at any point.
Yeah. Let's leave the collaborative documents ambiguously open to commenting, and then we'll maybe shut it down as soon as we either see it tapering off or getting too out of hand. And I will take way more information than my less. So it will, yeah, we'll remove, we'll add restrictions at some point in the future.
All right.
Thanks. Awesome. Okay. Well, I hope you all have an excellent day. Make sure to take care of yourselves. Thanks so much for participating. And yeah, look forward to seeing y'all soon.